Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan, and this is also Ryan. I guess you could say we're Ryan squared, as my friend Chris says. So we're here to talk about Austrian economics, the mixed economy, and political economy more broadly. So that would be how politics shapes the economy and economy shapes politics as well. So one way that we thought we'd get started is to talk about our mutual friend, Matthew Sciabarra, and his framework of dialectical libertarianism and how he critiqued, say, the Rothbardian sort of anarcho-capitalists in his book Total Freedom. That kind of sets the stage for the rest of our conversation. A easy way to look at this, right, is that dialectical libertarianism is including the dialectical portion, the art of context keeping. So it's trying to look at things from different levels of analysis, different lenses, different kind of side views, so that you get an overall stronger position when you're trying to figure out how to address a situation. The libertarian part, obviously, is a philosophy that's very much interested in individual freedom and flourishing. And so in combining the two, you can look at it as using the art of context keeping to promote the project of individual freedom and flourishing. And in Chris's book, he critiques what he considers that state-market dichotomy, where on the one end, the sort of anarcho-capitalists will try to resolve issues that they see between government and market by getting rid of the government entirely. And then on the other hand, you might have a hardline socialist or communist, and they'll see the problem and they'll go, well, we'll solve that by getting rid of the market. And this kind of understanding of how both sides are handling that issue, and in particular for this conversation, how the anarcho-capitalists are solving that by, okay, let's just get rid of the government, and then the market kind of decides everything. We see that as problematic, and other Ryan had floated around for a while the idea of specifically making an Austrian economics defense of what we call the mixed economy. And so I'll pass it on over to Ryan to kind of get us acquainted with what even is the mixed economy.
Well, that was a great intro. Yes. So the mixed economy, this would be a system where, of course, you're looking at a market order, right, with private property rights, exchange, market prices, and the commercial world of buying and selling. But and then, of course, the other thing that would be on top of that would be like a safety net, a social safety net, a court system, maybe regulations that are, protect consumers, protect the environment, the legal order that, puts all this together. Because, a lot of the anarcho-capitalists will argue that even the provision of the law itself is something that can be done without the influence of the government, right? We don't need government, we need governance. So kind of this is something to respond against, because in reality, we have governments, but we also have markets. And if we are going to reform any of the places in policy or in our society that maybe aren't helping us flourish, that are standing in the way of that, these partial views of what the problem is can sometimes impede us from even understanding, what should be done, what ought to be done, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of the point of this conversation, is just to get a more nuanced view of what an economy entails, and why a mixture of politics and markets, why this is not necessarily a bad idea. But as we see, like as you alluded to, it's not the most popular view, right? Like, if you were going to poll radicals, whether left or right, you're going to find very few people who will say, yeah, I check both boxes. I like what markets offer, but I also believe that the state and politics has something that they bring to the table too, right? So this defense of the mixed economy is sort of like a no man's land, right? And put it into Kersnerian terms, Israel Kirzner, there could be some unexploited profit opportunities here, right? For exchanging, bringing these ideas into harmony, into conversation, right? The arguments for markets and the arguments for a safety net and for the government provision of public goods. So that's kind of where we're coming from, right? Just trying to see where these things overlap.
Absolutely. No, I thought that was very well said. And it seems that, because when you mentioned radicals and how you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who's going to check both boxes of markets and some form of government, right? It seems that the allure of that is that whenever we're talking about the mixed economy, it sounds a little complicated. It sounds like it's messy, and it could be very difficult. Like you're always having to be constantly on alert because these things can interact in such complicated and deleterious ways. And so that's why you do get that kind of market state dichotomy. And so both sides want to cut the head off the snake, but each person has a different idea of which side the snake's head's on. It's like they're over here cutting off the snake on this side, and they're over here like you just cut the tail off. Like we're the ones cutting we're the ones cutting the true head off the snake. But we're kind of in this space of saying like, no, that's a fool's errand. Like you're going to have government, you're going to have markets if you want kind of an advanced modern society, which I think most of us do, right? I think most people in every country are not primitivists, right? They're not
Right.
looking to, you know, roll the clock backwards and give up all the gains that we've gotten from modernity
Right.
and even gains we've gotten from, say, industrial capitalism. But we're in this space of saying, okay, yes, we may like these gains. That doesn't mean we like everything, and it doesn't mean we have to accept everything. That there are
Right.
good critiques, and I think that's maybe a good springboard if you're comfortable with it,
Mhm.
of kind of maybe Steelmanning the Austrian case, right? Because we probably wouldn't be talking too much about it if we didn't think there was some baby in the bathwater, as the saying goes,
Exactly.
right? And
Right.
so clearly the Austrians seem to have something to offer us, but a lot of them tend to just go way too far. So
Right.
given that I think you're way better read on Austrian economists than I am, like where do you see some of that baby?
Yeah, well, I agree with you what you're saying. Because obviously, I wouldn't be interested in an Austrian defense of anything if I didn't think there was merit in these views, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's Austrians are known for a few big things. One of them is that I think is really important is the idea of subjectivity.
Mhm.
So if just do a little catch up, the marginal revolution is this big sea change in how we understand economic theory that occurred in the late 1870s,
Mhm.
1880s, and it transformed the theory of how value is what value is, where it comes from, and the nature of it, right? And essentially, to put it really simple, the pre-neoclassicals, the pre-marginals would say that value is an inherent in an item, right? So
Mhm.
if it's a hammer or if it's a piece of meat or something that you consume, a consumable, then the value is in its labor or the cost of production or whatever, right? So if it's a reproducible good, it's whatever the labor would have been to reproduce it, whatever the cost to bring another unit to market. That's the
Mhm.
cost, that's the value, right? So it was very much an objective story. It was either labor or just the general cost of the other factors as well. So the different people had different ideas on this, right? But it was generally a cost theory, okay?
Mhm.
And then the neoclassical, the marginal revolution, which starts neoclassical economics, turns that on its head, and it says no, value is not embedded in an object or in a good. It's actually in your head, and it's the importance you place on things when you become aware of how they meet your needs.
Mhm.
So it's this awareness, it's this thing, but it's also the relationship between the thing and the person, the valuing agent. And they understand, the property of the good. And so then they understand how that meets their needs and they rank those things and they come to this idea of its value. And of course, these things add up over time because we're in communication with others. So it's not just a solo activity. You're talking, you're bargaining with your neighbor or whoever. So this value then takes on a social dimension.
Mhm.
But the point is that it doesn't really have an objective um, foundation. It's really a subjective thing. So I think subjectivity is really one of the big things they get right. And you
Right.
see this not just in how you understand goods, but in terms of just the way people perceive things, right? Like, so the
Mhm.
way I see an event or the way you see an event, we are living in our own experiences with our own points of view, and so we don't all know the same things or experience the same things. So that subjective element, it's not just with goods and services, right? It's beyond that.
Right.
And I think that's valuable. And if you were going to say, well, what else? I would say then closely connected to this idea is what the role that institutions like prices can play in transmitting knowledge that might be unarticulated or
Mhm.
are unconscious or latent or distributed across multiple people, or there's all these ways that
Taxic
knowledge is
knowledge.
discussed about, right? Yeah, tacit, right? It might not be articulable, or it might, but it's embedded in these networks, right? And without exchange and prices, some of that knowledge is not made use of, right?
Hmm.
So Hayek and the Austrians will talk about, central planning and how planners have access to limited knowledge, but have to make these crazy decisions about how all these things are going to be ordered and allocated in their society, and they end up making plans that are way more that outstrip what they can know, right? So of course that blows up in their face. Anytime you plan things you don't really understand, the consequences are never good. So that's the other side of it. This story about fragmented knowledge and how to make use of it, and how there is this bottom up uh, process that we can all be a part of called the market, which helps us make better use of what is out there and what we do know, right? Make
Hmm.
fuller use of it. So I think those two stories, the subjectivity story, the knowledge and coordination story, both those are things you find specifically in Austrian economics. Not that other disciplines don't know these things and don't build them, but they don't take them as serious, right?
Right.
They'll often give lip service, but not really make it a core part of how they model how they think of the economy. They'll model it in a way that doesn't really reflect a true subjectivity methodological orientation,
Right.
right? It's more it's a label they'll agree with, but is it really informing their economics? And often not.
So if we're thinking about everyone has kind of tool chests and they've got various tools in those tool chests, a lot of economists will have the same tools, but some are going to use some tools more than the others. And the Austrians use the tools you just mentioned. You would see them as pivotal. They're important tools to take into account. And it's not trivial that they do focus on those tools and they have a sense of how they impact everything else.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good.
And we can go beyond that. There's other things to talk about too. I
Mhm.
think one other thing that deserves mention is that money is not neutral, right?
Mm.
So a lot of mainstream economics will model money as just another good, and they don't really trace out the implications of what happens when there's too much money or too little money, because it can happen. There can be these monetary disequilibriums that can happen in either direction, right? And they
Right.
have real consequences. And this is something that Austrians pay attention to. They've actually created their entire theory of economic fluctuations around this idea of what happens when the market for money is out of sync or out of equilibrium with the preferences of the people involved in the system. So that's front and center. So this idea that money is not neutral
Right.
has real consequences. That is another part of their
Mhm.
theory that is valuable, I would say.
Okay, yeah. So they have a lot of things to offer, even if some other economists utilize the same things to some extent or another, but they do it in a more robust way, and it's important to take into account. At the same time, we don't want to paint with a broad brush, but a lot of them, it's hard to separate their economics from their sort of libertarian philosophy, because
Yeah.
just as much as we say with political economy, it's examining how politics affects economics, and then there's of course economics affecting the politics. Well, when it comes to this kind of area of thinking, just as much as there's kind of thinking about the economic science, right, as you would put it, right, the things that we notice are sort of economic laws or ways that no matter where you go, you're going to have a supply and demand effect, that kind of a thing. um,
Right.
but there's also a sort of underpinning philosophy that's also impacting how strongly you make certain claims, or what claims you make, or what you think is just off the table, right? So I sometimes point out that I feel that there's a more cartoonish understanding of government, right? So it's one thing, as you were just pointing out, the critiques about central planning and trying to just coordinate the entire economy just from a bunch of people kind of sitting in a boardroom somewhere, and okay, I guess we'll just have this many toilet paper rolls next week, and down the line, all these goods and all the problems with that. But then
Right.
that's kind of stretched out to be like, government can't do anything. It's
Right.
just like this stupid, useless tool that just can do nothing right. It's just constantly doing things wrong. So that might be a good way to kind of pivot. I think.
Yeah,
What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I was kind of thinking about that as being a general thing to orient with this whole
Hmm.
conversation is that there's Austrian economics narrowly defined,
Right.
which is how we understand, human action, people pursuing their interest, and this comes under the heading of what's called catalytics if you're Hayekian. But
Hmm.
it's really just like the flows of decisions and how that adds up to being a price system and a production and exchange and all these things happen out of that, right? And those laws of economics that govern that, we learn about price controls, you can learn about the way that prices work. We're really talking about price theory here,
Hmm.
essentially, right? And it can be expressed in capital theory or monetary theory or trade theory or whatever. But there's this small body of like certain knowledge that Austrians would call it certain. Others would say it's not. It's contingent. But and they'll bicker and on that. But really, there are these consistent tendencies. We call them laws. I'd call them tendencies. But
Yeah.
but that's all very narrow. It's when the same individuals working in those spheres then put on their political economy hats and make pronunciations about welfare or public goods or the environment or other things and they make these pronunciations as if they have the same logical certainty as, say, the action axiom would have in their economic theory.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. There's all these contingent premises that have been added onto it, and it's not, and it's debatable whether or not those conclusions follow. So I think that's kind of where this conversation gets interesting is, well, where does the boundary between Austrian economics begin and political advocacy, right? And if there is a clear boundary, then how come that boundary is muddled so often? And these political arguments become sold to us as, you need to know this, you have to agree with this to be sound theory, to be sound in your economic theory,
Hmm.
which was kind of what we're trying to push back against, is to say, no, these economic tools can be used in ways that go beyond just a narrowly conservative approach to politics.
Gotcha. Yeah, very well
Yeah.
put. Very well put. So, how might we go about this? Well, I think one way, something that came to my mind right now was something I've seen Kevin Carson bring up over the time. So, Kevin Carson being a thinker out of C4SS, does a lot of kind of anarchist thinking, has a big focus on the commons, which funny enough, could also be a part of the mixed economy, right?
Sure.
And so, one way I saw him kind of look at it is that a lot of the times when the Austrian economics fans, start getting into the political side of things, like the political philosophy side of things, they'll talk about like redistribution, right? So they get really caught up on the redistribution, and there's
Mhm.
even as we were talking about with various welfare programs and stuff, we might think there is a case for that. But even before you can get there, there could be something called what Kevin said in this exchange I saw, predistribution. That there's like the rules of the game at the very outset, right? What are the property rights rules, right? What are the fundamental structures of society, right? Because you can have a free market and all kinds of, sort of societal arrangements. You could imagine,
For sure.
you know, big, indigenous tribes and having markets in between and stuff, but yet their society would look drastically different from the one we currently have, as well as the one maybe some of these Austrians would envision, right? If they got a purist
Right.
society in alignment with like what their ideals are. And so just on a fundamental level, a lot of the times it's kind of just taken for granted that, well, we're going to have some kind of a like a Lockean property system or something like that, right? And then the sort of the free market society is built off of that, but you're not really even thinking the fact that it's built off of it. You almost feel like they're intertwined, they're together. You get
Right.
both together, right?
Well,
By
what you're pointing at is that we don't really spend a great deal of time looking at the foundations of the market society, or the rules and the laws that came prior to, right? Because you
Right,
don't have exchange and all that unless you have a system of property that goes first. And then so you have to look, where did all this come from, right? And then
right.
I think the takeaway is that it's gonna be murky, right? You're not
Hmm.
gonna be able to say, oh, this is where it started. It's not gonna be simple.
Right.
But what you will find is that these things are entangled together just like
Right.
the chicken and egg problem, right? Which came first? It's like, well, you're not going to sort that out, right? So maybe if you don't have a dichotomous view of it, it'll just become easier to deal with this messy reality, right?
Right.
That there is an entanglement. And
Hmm.
I feel like that's kind of the next step, is that when you realize that yes, markets and commerce are important institutions, you can go two ways. You can say, okay, well, we're going to run with that all the way to this logical conclusion, and maybe it's illogical conclusion that it should be
Yeah.
the only system that we have, and then or you can be more measured and say, yeah, it's good, but let's understand it realistic. Let's not reify it, right, and turn it into something that's outside of our actual historical experience.
Right. And that's the point in total freedom that Chris starts making in terms of, sort of the Rothbardian anarchists is that, you know, um, all that we know of in terms of market society is that there's already foundations in place. You've got courts, you've got different kinds of legal structures, right? You have certain rules of the game that are all laid down, and they're foundational because, my ability to go and function in a market society is heavily based on those things working out the way they work out. And present day, we have quite a crisis going on in Haiti right now, where you really don't have any stable legal structure at all. You currently have a case where rival gangs are even more powerful than the government, the de facto government that's there. And so there's really not a rule of law anymore. You've got, wealthy people getting helicoptered out, and you've got, people who are kind of poor, marginalized, being taken advantage of.
Right.
And if we look at that situation and we go, okay, well, what's going on there if we analyze it from these various lenses, right? So we have that kind of mixed economy perspective where a lot of different institutions are necessary and important. But if you look at it from a different perspective of only one institution matters and that can handle everything, well, it seems like it's a lot more difficult to assess what's going on there, right?
Right.
You can point
Right.
out, oh, well, there's a long history of, governments doing stuff, but like even on their view, they know that that's the case. We don't have a push a button and restart. You're always going to be in a context where there was previous stuff being done. So this is a
Right.
case where the nation states pretty much failed. It's a kind of a free for all. So why aren't you seeing this other thing just rise up and flourish rather than everyone's kind of running away, kind of hurdled in
Well,
their homes?
I think one takeaway is that the state is not the only thing holding us back from paradise,
Right,
right? So because they've
right.
gotten rid of it, and clearly they haven't figured that out, right? So we can say that's not the case, that there's more going on than just
Mm,
overwhelming that institution. We've got it figured out, right?
right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely doesn't make the anarchist case look believable.
No. And Pete Leeson, who's kind of, I think he considers himself an Austrian
Mhm.
economist, right?
Mhm.
He had a book, I think I even have it here somewhere, but it had to do essentially with examining like real world statelessness, right?
Yeah. Is
And
that
one
the
of the,
pirate book you're
no,
talking
it's
about?
not the pirate book. It's
Okay.
I bet I could find it real quick.
It's like private governance or something like
Anarchy
that.
Unbound: Why Self-Governance Works Better Than You Think. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so one of the kind of, if we want to talk about case studies that he uses, is looking at Somalia before it became, sort of this, I guess you could say semi-statelessness. Some would say full statelessness, however you want to put it, because there are these kind of different factions and stuff, kind of like what you see in Haiti right now, right? But the argument he makes is that when it had its state, it was a much more hellish society. We're not going to praise where it's at right now. So he's not giving it like yeah, this is what we want. He's like, you'd rather be in the
Hmm.
United States than be there. But he is
Hmm.
saying that like if you're doing like kind of a comparative analysis, you also can't kind of go to this other extreme that some strong state's always going to be necessarily better. Sometimes these other
Right.
conditions, as bad as they
That's
still
true.
may be, are also not quite as bad. Like, if I had to take, say, that over, some dictator who's going around rounding people up and shooting them, it's like, okay, fine, right? But now we're just,
Statelessness
yeah,
is the win here.
yeah. But, just as we're talking about, it's comparative, right? That doesn't mean that you then say, okay, there's the goal. And as far as I recall, it's been a long time since I read that book. He kind of says, like, all things equal, it's still preferable to say be in the United States. And we wouldn't want
For
to see
sure.
this thing just get overthrown overnight because it's not likely that something good would replace it, essentially.
Right. Right.
And if you, let's say you were an ANCAP in Haiti for all these years, and you're like, man, I can't wait for this state to fall overnight. Well, you got your wish. I mean, granted, there is still something that's still there in a sense, and there's police that are fighting the gangs, but they're much weaker. Like they no longer have their authority, right? They don't have
Right.
their significance. They're no better than any other gang, right?
Right.
And so,
Well,
yeah,
you know,
go ahead.
it's interesting because it's kind of like those are the competing private defense companies, right? At a
That's right.
certain level.
Yeah,
And something else that I read, or I didn't read, I saw something on Haiti recently, and I didn't know this to be true, but apparently it is. These gangs were, prior to the system just collapsing, they were like these private militias of these very elite entities in society, right? So
right,
the nation state kind of gave up the ghost and was not functioning, and
right.
so the elite said, okay, well, I'm going to hire this gang, particular gang, to serve
Mhm.
my interests, and then the others did the same, and then over time the gangs got more powerful than the people hiring them. So they just said, well, we're going to be on our own now. We're going to no longer be your emissary. We're no longer on your payroll. We're going to just take over operations and just run our own thing.
Right,
And so
right.
that's kind of where we're at now, I guess, was these gangs vying for power. So like a power vacuum, essentially.
When you look at that situation that you're describing there, and you think of some of the hypothetical theorizing that goes on in like books like The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman, he doesn't identify as an Austrian, but he has a lot of overlap with them, right? He's an anarcho-capitalist, right?
Right.
I guess he's kind of like in the Chicago school in a sense, kind of like his father, Milton. But
Yes.
the overlap is so close. It's like very, very close.
They're
Um,
arguing on, is utility ordinal or cardinal, or it's like the very narrow things that the economists will argue about. But yeah, you're right. Politically, they're like this is the same thing.
Right. And so, when you look at the arguments that go on about like these private defense agencies and stuff, and like why wouldn't they choose violence? And the idea is like they wouldn't want to choose violence because like it's costly. And the problem with that is it also assumes that humans are perfectly rational. I don't want to say perfect, maybe, but just very rational, and that efficiency and cost are always going to be up here, right?
Right.
Nothing
Yes.
else will trump it,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Right.
yet,
Right.
if we look at what's going on in Haiti, I think you probably could do a better analysis of it than I can, but it seems that that's not what's happening necessarily. You can have someone who, if they wanted to just maximize profit, maybe I shouldn't be just up all hours of the night and going and, as the term goes, raping and pillaging, right? Just
Hmm.
senseless violence, because you're not always even getting that much money in the process, and you're probably wasting
Right.
materials. You're using ammunition, you're using your energy resources, your time. If you want to go, time is money. Like it
Yes.
doesn't really make sense other than you have other values that are asserting themselves. You have
You're
other
maximizing a different value.
in
Yeah.
different ways. Yeah,
And if people always were careful to avoid those kinds of costly actions, you wouldn't have war,
right.
right? Yeah, so there's a reason. So, and the other thing that I thought about as you said that is that, the Austrians are the first to tell you that costs and benefits are subjective, right?
Hmm.
So just to say that, it's too costly to engage in war, the defense companies are going to cooperate. It's like, well, that's assuming that you can know their costs and
Yeah.
their benefit, the way they view those benefits, right? Because those things are subjective.
I know some people right now, this is slightly tangential, but I think it helps with this kind of, the cost thing being supreme or whatever in this
Hmm.
rationality, who are wanting to build a house. And, they currently, it's going to be like something like 1.9 million. It's going to be very arduous, the whole process and everything like that. From a financial standpoint, it would seem by anyone's imagination, if you were trying to maximize your savings and your money and all that, and your purchasing power even, right, that you would probably say, hey, how about we go for a cheaper house, right? You could buy
Right.
one that's already built somewhere for probably like in that region, like 600,000, right? And you'd be just as fine. But they have other values. They have dreams. So their dream was to be in a certain place, right?
Hmm.
And it comes at a cost. And so
Right.
they're willing to pay an exorbitant amount more. We're talking in that case 1.3 million more to
Right.
live a dream. Well, in these
Yep.
gang situations, these de facto
They're
protection agencies,
they're doing the
they
same thing.
they have their own dream, right? It's just a
Yep.
very hellish one. And I think too much, especially with these hypotheticals, it assumes like you look out at our society, right? And for the most part, I know we're going to be running out of time, by the way, so we'll just be coming back for everyone who is watching. You'll notice that things aren't quite like what's going on in Haiti, right? There's some order. We typically expect people are going to act relatively peaceful. We're not seeing everyday people getting punched in the face in a lot of our areas. I'm not saying there aren't areas where it's worse, but
Sure.
in my daily experience, it's not everyone's fighting constantly, right? So something's going right in some way, right? And it oftentimes seemed that the experience of living in a society like this where you aren't dealing with constant conflict, it's easy to take it for granted and go, oh, well, if we just stripped it of all these institutions, then we would continue acting like this. And the kind
Yes.
of agencies that exist in this society would take that same shape, ignoring
You
everything
almost
else.
It's almost like the culture and society would continue without the institutions or the laws or the rules. That
Right.
there's no reason to think that devoid of those incentives in that system that we would just continue. Like that's kind of an ahistorical view. It's very much in keeping with the equilibrium kind of view that you see that the Austrians will criticize of neoclassicals. They'll say that's a timeless equilibrium. You haven't put real change, you haven't put real people, real assumptions in there.
Right.
You just got a static equilibrium you've generated there. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, that's true often. But that same criticism, I think, can apply just as powerfully to the kind of ideas that we're talking about here with that suggest that everything that civilization is not context dependent.
Right.
That it's just this permanent thing endowed on us because for some reason, I don't know if it's because of our language or we were born in a certain part of the Western Hemisphere or whatever it is, but there's something that's just conferred upon us civilization. We don't need to be worried about losing it.
And yet we have examples in our own, country, where in areas where typically it's on a more micro level, like we haven't seen this in any time recent, society-wide issue like this. You could maybe make the case the Civil War was kind of like that in a way, but still different. But when you look at situations like Hurricane Katrina, where an area is just absolutely decimated, you had the National Guard having to be put out there and different, agencies because there's massive looting. And
Right,
some people were,
right.
being basically dragged out of their homes at gunpoint, by people who are just taking advantage of the situation. And so that's a situation there where institutions have broken down. It's because of an awful disaster, and now you've got people trying to exploit the situation, unfortunately.
Right,
And that's
right,
within the confines of a modern nation state that's very, very wealthy, maybe the most wealthy country of all time, right? So
right.
why, like, so if it can even happen in that sense because there was a bad hurricane, like, just imagine something much larger, right? Maybe the power grid's taken out by some, artificial intelligence or something like that, or whatever the case may be, right? Something massive happens, even the so-called civilized society that you're used to can very quickly become very not civilized, right?
For sure.
And so I'm not sure if that sparked something for you or not, but like I think that's where I was coming from it as well. Is just that
Yeah,
it's bad enough in, say, a situation like Haiti, where you think, well, they've had problems for a long time. They haven't had really a strong government at all or any kind of, strong rule of law. And you pointed out the history there with the gangs and such. But, oh, that's not going to happen here. And yet we
right.
have small examples in short time frames where it does happen. So,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that is that assumption that we're really more evolved and we're better. The better angels of our nature will take over. I think that that's overwrought. Like you see
Yeah.
it because we're used to the order that's a product of this entangled system, this commerce and politics coming together
Hmm.
that produces the modern world, right? But
Right.
take that all away, and it's like, well, you go back to I got to survive and whatever and everything that goes with that, right?
Right. Right. And taking the mixed economy kind of perspective that we're taking maybe in the other direction, maybe a little in favor of the libertarian, is that at the same time that having a situation where that breakdown is like that, right? Things are not very, strong robustly on the institutional level, right? And so you get all these problems. You can also have the opposite issue where the form of governance, whatever that looks like in our context, it's usually a modern nation state, becomes too powerful and unchecked. And you get
Right.
all kinds of cronyism that goes on, right? The Soviet Union was riddled with it.
Hmm.
You have abuse of people, and that can break down
For
order.
sure.
And the only thing maybe keeping things in check is people roaming around that are called police or military with guns threatening people, but it's usually not a very good society, right? And so
No.
you get bad problems when you go that direction, right? So when we're thinking of that, going back to that state market dichotomy, it's not all just like, oh yeah, all hail the state, or the market to be damned. It's just
Right.
taking into account, no, you want good governance institutions that make sure that you can have these gains of so-called civilization, right?
Right.
But you also want checks and balances so that this part of the equation doesn't get too extreme either, because then you're going to get a bad society as well, which goes back to Pete Leeson going, all right, yeah, maybe semi-statelessness, Somalia is not so great, but like, hey, it's way better than the state-based society they had before. Okay, great. So now we're just simply looking at, all right, what is that good mixture that we can have that tries to balance out these different competing concerns, essentially?
Right.
And so just to kind of recap, do a little summary, we started by looking at the state market dichotomy examined by Matthew Sciabarra, and looked at how, the kind of extreme socialist communists want to resolve that issue with getting rid of the market, and the Anarcho-Capitalists want to get rid of the state, essentially, the government. And we kind of looked at how there are problems with both of those. From the mixed economy perspective, we started to look at, okay, well, where are the benefits of the Austrian perspective? And then we kind of looked at where might there be some problems, especially with this combining of Austrian economics and libertarian philosophy. So we examined, the issue of Haiti, present day, and everything they're putting up with the the gang violence and such, where there really isn't much of a nation state left. The gangs are more powerful. We looked at Pete Leeson's examining of Somalia, where it turned out the kind of quasi-statelessness that it currently has is preferable to the awful state system it had before. So just kind of this broad comparative analysis where it shows, okay, in some circumstances, you may be better off with some of those without having some of those nation states, especially when they're especially authoritarian, right? Because
Right.
you can have societal breakdown in both directions, whether it's you don't have any good governance at all, and so you're not going to have a good market economy, and everything's going to go to the wayside, essentially. And then you can have the other problem where the state just gets out of control, and it becomes very authoritarian. There's cronyism writ large, and then you have problems too. A lot of that happened with the Soviet Union. So
Right.
that's kind of where we left off, was kind of looking through all that stuff. Now we kind of want to switch gears a little bit. I think one way to do it is to just give one kind of a summarizing quote of what were we really saying about all of that, which is to say that the people who want to throw all the government out, essentially, they just want the market to decide everything. Very oftentimes where they're coming from is this sort of, although they wouldn't say it themselves, Robinson Crusoe problem or framework of wanting the gains of a civilization without the responsibility or costs involved. And that kind of wraps that all up, I think, if Ryan wants to add anything to that. But I think that's kind of what pulls it all together.
Yes, I would say that captures it. And also, if I was going to add anything, I would say there's this parallel tendency to look at things in a universal, ahistorical sense, where there's these universal laws that matter, that do not have any real contingency connected to time, place, culture, institutions, context. It's really just these laws. They're abstract, they're ahistorical, and it's just a matter of applying them right. It's like, oh, we can solve the poverty issue. You just need private property and free markets. And there's really not a lot of contextual analysis involved in that. It's just very much an abstract thing. This is the way, and then you see it with morality too. You see, so we can get into that in a minute. But not only is the economic stuff, reified and turned into an elixir for every problem, but then there's also this objective tendency to view ethics as also a simple mathematical equation that you can plug in. You can have an ethical vision, say the non-aggression principle, and everything can be solved through this rubric, right? It's like this magic, this magic tool that really has no complications involved in it. Everything's very simple with it. And I think so. If you're going to say what's the other part of this, is that this tendency to oversimplify and to abstract from actual history, and to just consider things in an ahistorical kind of way that's not realistic terribly.
No, it sort of points to the answer being wipe the slate clean and then just impose these correct rules on everyone, these correct ways of ordering things, and then all will be okay, essentially.
Sounds totalitarian.
Yeah, it sounds like it would require quite a bit of central planning in a sense. If you're going to really, especially
Really
when
do
they
it.
take into account,
Yeah.
the history of where you're at right now, everything that's been, like look at New York City and the complicated history of all those property lines drawn and the way industries have,
Hmm.
embedded themselves in the structure of the overall city and such. I mean, it's just so complicated all the way down. So just it would be interesting to see like how would they even go about it, right? And if it's
Right.
just simply, well, let's just turn the switch off, everything gets overthrown overnight. Now we're falling into that territory of what we talked about earlier of, well, what exactly happens after that? And it doesn't
Yeah.
seem very likely that it's going to be some neat and clean,
Right.
transitory state where we all just go, well, we're just going to still keep pushing our shopping carts in peace. There's no one, shooting guns off in my direction, right? That there's likely going to be just a lot of breakdown and problems and confusion
Yes.
because now you don't have any stable rules or sort of institutions that you can point to and go to figure out, all right, all right, whose is this over here and like how does this work over here? Like you have problems because you have a
Right.
long history of people building up patterns of relating and institutions that they depend on, and you just throw that out overnight, and then it
Yes.
becomes kind of a race for, well, who's going to replace those institutions and what are those going to look like in a country with a long history of white supremacy and white supremacist groups. So, sounds like you're going to have a lot of people vying for who gets to impose what where.
No doubt. Yeah. And then the other thing I would think about is what happens to the incentives facing actors when they get to have the option to be the judge in their own case? Because there's a
Mm,
great benefit. We're talking about weighing, how do people act? Are they acting rational or not? Cost benefit.
right,
Well, it's costs aren't the only thing you look at. You also want to consider, well, what is the benefit to acting, right? Because
right.
then if the cost is greater than the benefit, of course you won't do it. But the benefit to being the judge in your own case or to being the lawgiver, if you were able to establish that corporation or that new institution, that's a great benefit. That's a great incentive to
Mm,
then grab some men and capture the block or whatever to enforce that.
hmm.
So yeah, I think that's something that came up in my mind. Just that
Yeah,
this benefit, of being the judge in your own case is something that's not just uh, another just another line of activity, like opening a cheeseburger stand, right? Like these are not the same, and they should
right.
be analyzed as different, right?
It's like when you look at internal reviews, whether it's like a police department's doing the investigation of the police, right? So they're
Hmm.
they're having the police investigate the police, and
Right,
how often that accountability doesn't actually get you don't see it actually come into place, right?
right,
Or even within corporations. Oh, there was an abuse claim. Well, we're doing an internal investigation, and
yeah.
doesn't often go as well as we'd like it, right?
Or we have
So,
some arbitration path for you to go down. Don't go to the courts.
right,
You know,
yeah,
we
yeah.
there's an arbitration clause that you're bound by, right? So yeah,
More
there's a reason.
so often it's that case, right? Where like
Yeah,
when you get to decide how it's going to go to hold you accountable, it doesn't tend to go as well as it would as if some other person was able to hold you
right,
accountable. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
And circling back to the property rights thing, the Austrians make a really good case for why private property is essential in terms of any kind of society, right, to solve these conflicts of who gets to use what. And I feel like, yeah, that's true. That's a good argument for that. But then you could say the government's a similar technology, right? It's there to kind of solve these conflicts, not just who gets what. That's one way to think of it, but it's also what ought to be done with this
Right.
this surplus, right? Because see, that's something that the Austrian school and the Crusoe economics that comes out of it is not always putting it front and center, is that there is this social surplus. Like markets and commerce are great because they're so productive. They
Right.
they increase the amount of goods and services that we would have otherwise, many, many times over. And when you put it into motion and you set it through time, then it compounds and you get living standards that are, reflecting the modern world.
Right.
So the point is that this Crusoe model of individual atomistic economic decision making that all Austrian economics really starts from, whether you're talking about Rothbard or Mises or Menger or any of the others, they all tend to have a foot in this world, it seems to stress scarcity. You have a Crusoe, you have a Crusoe figure who's on an island without, without any other person to kind of provide goods and services. So it's a story of him making a net and catching fish and, and all these things. But that doesn't really highlight the truly salient factor of, or the truly salient characteristic of the modern world, which is this great surplus that we get from producing and dividing labor and using capital to augment labor and to exchange the surplus. Like all of this is done because it makes us radically better off.
Right, right.
And
And
the market apologists will make that case without taking it to its full conclusion, I think. And I'll let you take it from there.
oh yeah, no, I was gonna say, I had appreciated you'd pointed out to me recently. I still have to watch it. The online personality unlearning economics, how he very much focuses on that in his recent video about this issue of like
Yes.
scarcity and surplus, and how it's kind of taken, well, we have scarcity, and that's what economics is all based around. But I think as you put it, and you probably put it better than I could put it, but that he examines basically like when that agricultural revolution occurred. Now you've got this big surplus, but now you're getting nation states built, you're getting massive inequality, violence of different sorts, right? You're getting all these other issues, and so
Bureaucracy.
there's a greater story to be told here, and it's not as simple as they make it out to be. So yeah, no, I'm just
Yeah.
I appreciate that context for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a good segue kind of into some of the policy issues that we were wanting to talk about, right?
Right.
And
So
let's talk about, I got one theoretical point to add, and then we can get
okay,
into the actual meat and bones of the policy stuff, right?
right.
So just generally speaking, there's not a lot of arguments for, well, there's not a lot of Austrian arguments for the mixed economy, right? For a
Mhm,
social safety net, for taxation, let alone progressive taxation, but just
mhm.
taxation at all. But let's just say there's not a lot of arguments for having transfer payments or food stamps or Head Start or or let alone a public option, right? I mean
Right.
that's now we're getting into to like a luxury, like late stage luxury, So anyway, so I think there is a case to be made, right? I think you can take Austrian arguments, things that are well-worn premises that you hear in libertarian and Austrian circles. I think you can take some of these arguments and you can actually make a straightforward case for having a social safety net.
Mhm,
And let's see if you find this compelling.
mhm,
And so first let's start with the one that everybody knows about, right? Money and its redistributive uh potential, right? So I
mhm.
mean, obviously there's a story about money and central banks and banks in general creating money out of thin air or and then loaning it into existence, and then it takes this pathway through the economy where it's first injected into a certain it's loaned into existence, so it becomes the balance of a private entity. They spend that balance, whether it's buying raw materials or labor or factors of production or whatever they spend it on. It starts to circulate. And as this new money circulates, it bids up prices in every market it touches, right? And then so there's
Mhm.
this uneven price um, effect, right? Where the markets that get the money first see prices go up, and then as it circulates, it bids up prices as it goes, and eventually the entire economy is then lifted by it, is touched by it in some way. But
Mhm.
the story has a redistributive element where the purchasing power that this money represents comes at the expense of those who get it last, right? Because they're getting at the end of this chain, and they're the last to get it, and but meanwhile, all before they've received that payment, all of their costs have gone up because it's been generating inflation on the other side of the economy, right?
Right.
So there's been this transfer in a very real sense from the holders of money to the whoever gets the money first, right? There's this
Right.
transfer, and there's a price effect, and there's a distortion in how the economy allocates resources, and we call that the Austrian business cycle theory. But that's not where I'm going with this.
Right.
Where I'm going with this is that this is a redistribution of wealth, kind of like not too different from taxing somebody and giving it to somebody else, right? It's just not done through a visible mechanism. It's more of an invisible hidden taxation, right? So, and the Austrians talk about that quite a bit. And they'll go on and talk about other regulations and interventions, which also redistribute wealth. And so you could look at the intellectual property regime and how that forecloses competition in certain lines of production. And you could look at other regulations. And of course, not all regulations fit this standard of being just these cost imposing barriers that reduce economic activity, but many do, right?
Hmm.
And so, but regardless, there is this well-worn Austrian argument about how certain firms will lobby for regulations in order to impose, a higher entry into that industry, and then they can achieve some monopoly profit level that wouldn't be possible if there was this open entry, free competition thing going on, right? And those profits, those outsized profits, are they come at the expense of the ability of other people to generate income from themselves, whether it's starting their own company or selling their own services to another company who would be competing or whatever. There's a real clear link between the profits of some and the excluded incomes of others, right? There's this
Hmm.
nice relationship. So if you see this happening in the economy, and you can point to banking, you can point to regulations, you can point to intellectual property, you can point to the nature of knowledge. People are not always aware of what, there's uncertainty, there's distributed knowledge, so you might not make the best deal, right? So there's all kinds of
Hmm.
inefficiencies that are embedded just in markets and commerce, right?
Right.
And you throw the policy stuff on it and it's making it worse, right? So there's this clear story of, yeah, okay, yeah, people are being taken advantage of.
Hmm.
And so what I'm saying is the conclusion here is that, okay, if there's a loss, if there's some excluded group from this story, then it goes to reason just through basic principles of justice and fairness that they should be compensated, right? Like
Right.
it just as if the government were to deprive you of your property. There's this constitutional standard that they have to then, pay you for that, or it's a taking, right? So there is a taking happening here. And the Austrians are great at pointing it out,
Right.
but don't really have an answer to how to make up for it and shoot down every attempt that you hear about trying to make that right. Not by
Right.
undoing the damage, which is impossible, but by making up for it through some kind of a benefit that's paid for through, wait for it, taxes on profits. So it's not a, it's not necessarily just like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Like there is a responsibility here. So I'll throw that over to you, but that's my argument.
I think the thing that I wanted to say that would be like buttressing what you just said up and complementing it would be a thinker that I've really only recently gotten better acquainted with, Dr. Karl Widerquist. That's Karl with a K. He has his own kind of philosophy that he created. He calls it Indepentarianism. And the name isn't really as important as it is like kind of the underlying thinking, which is that um, so in the stuff that I've read of him, he points out the fact that no society, in his view anyway, and I think he's probably right, can reach full consensus. You are always going to have people who are othered in some sense, people who do not agree with the overall structure of that society. And I imagine just almost in every society that's modern, there's probably going to be primitivists of some sort, and they're going to be upset about all kinds of things that are going on, right? And you're probably not going to be able to perfectly, I don't want to say pay them off, but you're probably not going to be able to perfectly compensate
Compensate.
them in some, yeah, compensate them in such a way that they would actually be pleased. But that doesn't get you off the hook of taking it seriously, right? And
Right.
so, from his perspective, you know, if we're looking in the case, let's just say of historical capitalism, this is a messy thing that Chris always likes to bring up and Kevin Carson always likes to bring up, but a lot of the Austrians don't like to bring up, which is the closing of the enclosure of the commons, right? It
Yes.
took forcing people out of their historical conditions that they worked the land together, right? They were able to utilize the open fields and everything, and they had their micro village and all that kind of stuff. That it made no sense to talk as humanprogress.org likes to talk about of, oh, they're living on a certain amount of money, dollars and cents per day, when it's like, no, because they're not requiring the cash nexus so much. It doesn't even make sense to think about their lifestyle in terms of dollars and cents per day because so
Right.
much of it is being done communally, not based in money exchange. Not that there was no market exchange, it's just it wasn't this over dominant thing that we can't see our way out of because we're so used to it now. And so once you violently enclose those commons, and there's plenty of research done on actual quotes at that time of industrialists basically saying like, hey, if we've got to make these people work for us, we basically kind of have to rob them of their independence in a sense, right? And so in order to get the system that you're talking about, where it's like there's this hidden mechanism and like, people are benefiting, but it doesn't seem as like clear as like when you get taxed, right? And like the government took some money and gave it over here or whatever. But in a very real and much more fundamental sense than simply a single tax that just happened in a moment, you're talking about a society-wide flipping of the table and imposing new rules in place that now completely shifts the overall society. So now you are talking about how many dollars and cents are these people living on, because now they're dependent on working for somebody so that they can get all the things that they need to live. Because now, where they once maybe tilled the land together and they cooked and they had their own, houses and stuff. Now it's like, okay, out to the city where you got to pay rent or, hopefully afford a house, and, you got to go to the store. There's all this other stuff, right? And so in a very real sense, you have imposed yourself in the same way that a government may impose a tax, except in a much more brutal way, and much more freedom-robbing way. Like if you take, let's just say I make 75,000 a year, and you take 12,000 of that 75,000. I'm not saying I'm pleased, like, that's quite a bit of chunk out of my, out of my income. And I might not want it to be so much for making so, that amount, but it's still not the same thing as you robbed me of my entire livelihood and made me completely subjugated to someone else. Not especially in a society-wide sense. We're not talking just an individual case. And so
it's class war. It's clearly class war.
Absolutely. And so from this perspective, what you were talking about, because you're getting there about that compensation point. Well, that goes with what Karl's saying. He's like, look, you look at the world, you look at world history, there are no angels. There are no societies where they can show that there's no blood on their hands, as the saying goes, right? There's massive rights violations through and through. If we look at the history of modern property rights, it's just constant rights violations. Whether we go back and look at, antebellum slavery and, beyond that, we look at the robbing, enclosure of the commons, like just through and through. So we have to deal with the context that we're in, as Chris would say. And for those who may be just getting in, that's Chris Matthew Sciabarra. And in our context, we have all these violations. We have had this system imposed on us. And as you pointed out, a lot of that money is getting directed to the wealthy, and you've got a lot of inequality. And so from Karl's perspective, who takes self-ownership, which is, libertarian concept, very seriously, but he takes it in a more robust sense. I forget the name he calls it. There's a one word that goes in front of self-ownership, but nonetheless, or maybe there's like a word on the end as well, but basically it's a robust self-ownership. And a part of that is basically building up the independence of each individual. Hence, independentarianism is his philosophy. He doesn't think that you can solve the problem of excluding people in a sense. Like there's always going to be someone who's upset about the way things are. And so the best we can do is to try to minimize the harm we are causing them. And that's his perspective. You could say it's a very bleak one. Like that sucks. Like maybe wouldn't it be great if we didn't have that? And I'm sure the ANCAPs and the market anarchists, all those types will be like, well, we already solved that problem, because and
we got rid of the state.
Right. And for all the reasons that we've said today, that's why we're skeptical of that response. But, putting that aside, it's with the conditions that exist and with the likely policies that are open to us, this seems to be the pathway forward. So I didn't want to rob
that's a great.
time.
No, not at all. You made a great point. I think it's a good segue. You kind of triggered a thought in my head that leads us to the next thing perfectly. So we've been both mentioning the fact that this kind of utopian, we have to solve it by getting rid of the evil mentality.
Right.
That when you really hold that as your path for reform, it cuts you off from all the realistic pathways that would literally help things now in the real world, right? So it's very much this radical burn it all down perspective is actually useful for preserving the status quo.
Right.
And I feel like that's an underappreciated point. Like you
Yeah.
know, and we can talk about things like whether it's the environment or
Mhm.
the Americans with Disabilities Act or
Right.
various policies and regulations that we could say have measurable real world impact in making the world a better place that
Right.
would be opposed by the purists that would say, oh, no, 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 you can't violate, you can't, this is private property, or this is an intervention, or the government shouldn't do that. It's not, you're overwhelming you're moving you got too much politics in my commerce, right? And
Right.
it's really kind of a status quo perspective, a very conservative perspective, a very elitist
Yeah.
perspective in terms of its outcomes. And I wonder how you feel about anarchism in the service of the elite, and how did we get there? Like how did that happen,
Right. That it is a funny way to put it. And it's interesting because when you mention things like the environment, and we can think of a key policy proposal like Montreal Protocol, which happened under, ironically, Reagan and Thatcher, the so-called
Right.
free market capitalists, titans of their day, in terms of politicians. Um, or we could think of the Clean Air Act, or in what you mentioned, the Americans with Disabilities Act. If we brought these things up, the kind of people who are going to push back on us from the sort of market anarchist perspective, whether they're ANCAPs or they're not, they're gonna immediately hone in on what they see as the negatives that come out of those policies. And I think what's very important is to pause, because for some people, if some negatives are immediately brought to their attention, they go, "Oh shoot, I guess I can't support that after all." But the thing that you have to remember is there are trade-offs with everything. There is no perfect society because humans are not perfect, right? We're constantly trying to do better, but we are an imperfect species. We always have limited cognitive abilities, limited attentional resources, limited time, right? Chris always likes to point out when he critiques some of the more like post-scarcity communists is like there's always a scarcity of time, right? And
Yep.
so there's scarcity in other ways. It's not resources, right? Or the
Mhm.
physical ones we often think of. And so like taking that, you have to think of like, okay, so maybe like with the Americans with Disabilities Act, there has been some research to show like um, since it's been put in place, there's been maybe a reduction of employment for people who may want to work but are they have some form of disability. And it's like, okay, well, we don't want to ignore that, but actually let's also talk to those same people who may be frustrated with that. And none of them are saying, let's get rid of the ADA. They're saying, let's make it better, because they're like, hey, see what my life was like, 35 years ago when there wasn't all of these like, because again, it's another taking it for granted. Like the sidewalks are the way they are, ramps exist,
Yep.
buses have to have something to be able to lift up, wheelchairs and such. And they have to be of a certain size so that they can accommodate a multitude of different sized wheelchairs that are in the, like the private sector and such.
Mhm.
And so it's taken for granted, but like this is a massive win for people with disabilities because it makes, you want to talk about freedom, it makes freedom so much more expansive for people who they can't so easily maneuver the world in the same way that you and I can, right?
Right.
And that's something that I just don't think they take seriously, because when they go, oh well, you ignored the fact that you know there's research showing that they're not employed as much and that might be hitting their income a little bit. It's like, okay, but then your response is, well, let's just get rid of it. And then they have to wait for however long for things to evolve and just so basically they want everything that has happened to come about through some long evolutionary process. And then they'll be happy with it. The same outcome, but just through a long evolutionary process. And it's like, well,
Right.
that's very convenient for you who are not struggling in that way. How long do you have to wait? 100 years? Think of how
Right.
long we've had this system. So if we start industrial capitalism around 1800, let's just do that for simplicity's sake, right? So from 1800 to 1990, that's 190 years, correct?
Mhm. Mhm.
So in 190 years, you still didn't have a society that seriously took people with disabilities. I like to do people first language. People with disabilities rights seriously. So
Mhm.
how long did they have to wait? If 190 years didn't do it, another 190 years, we'll all be
Right.
dead. We won't even be in the conversation at that point. And instead, it was a Republican with the Congress that was in place, George H.W. Bush. I see we have our 10-minute mark, but who essentially kind of pushed this. And it did make massive changes for people who you can speak to them today about what was life before, like before, and what is it now. And it's a night and day difference. By the time we got to the year 2000, this society was night and
Transformed.
day different.
Yeah.
but you only noticed it if you really, truly struggled with the society that before. If
Right.
you noticed it because you didn't struggle, you were probably complaining about, oh, why do they have so many, like disabled parking spots, or over here? And
Hmm.
you're complaining about the fact that like you didn't have to deal with, oh, now I have to park maybe a little further away.
Right.
And you're bothered about how that feels like an encroachment to your freedom. Just think about the people who couldn't go into society much at all
Right.
because it just was structured in such a
The
large scale
access.
systemic way. The access was
Yeah.
not there.
Right.
And so that's my problem is, yes, you can find negatives with pretty much everything. The question is what trade-offs are we putting up with? And they almost always are willing to make up with this trade-off that leaves the lesser off much worse off, especially for a long period of time until their long evolutionary process can work itself out. And
Hmm.
I think, from my perspective, and someone could say I'm wrong, I'm fine to have someone challenge me on it, but when we can do better, we should. We
Right.
should try to. And we might go, maybe later on, we need to rethink things. We need to make some changes. And that's all fine and well. There's no saying that once you do it, that's how it has to stay and there can be no edits. But that's a far cry away from saying you can never do anything like that. And
Right.
that's where we get sort of, the problem that, we've both been talking about this whole time.
Right. Yeah. It seems like there's an issue with imagination, right? This single variable calculus where it's like, oh, look, some employment rates dropped a little bit. So obviously this is all for nothing. It's like, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute here. Let's look at the other side of the ledger.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
What are we
exactly.
getting here for this? We're getting something great, or potentially. So let's not just look at the cost, right?
If the cost is, oh crap, some people are not working right now, maybe their income took a hit, and now the response is, but hey, guess what? We could go back to 1989 where we wipe clean all of the ramps and all that stuff, right? We just go
Hmm.
completely back. And now you go, oh, come on. Like that seems like such a massive disparity in
Right.
terms of costs. Like,
Right.
it's
Undoing all of this. Yeah.
undoing all this and
Yeah.
like, and who's taking the hit here? Like that's the
Right.
thing. So
Well,
yeah,
I remember being in that headspace, and it's a mindset of being super unconcerned with outcomes
right,
and just being
right.
very process driven. So it's
Yeah.
like, oh, this was not done according to my narrow vision of what's ethical, or it's not voluntaristic, right? There's someone had to be taxed to make this, or there's some kind of command and control mechanism involved. So it's not freedom enhancing for that in that narrow way. And
Right.
so then obviously I'm just opposed, right? I remember being in that headspace.
Yeah, well, I'll
Yeah.
tell you what, like I remember like, the palms getting a little sweaty when I thought like, I'd get my arm twisted into defending government, because it was like you show me a problem that like because, I care about other people, right? I'm not a sociopath or something or a psychopath. Like I don't want to see a lot of people suffering or struggling, right? And it's like, oh, don't tell me only government can do this because I want government to be gone, right? And so when you're in that space that like government's the most evil outcome no matter what. So we're not talking about
Hmm.
the comparative analysis where sometimes it isn't so
Right.
good and you got to change and all that stuff. We're just talking about this absolute like you just got to eliminate it no matter what in all times and places. When you take that stance, now you're tied. It's like your arm's tied around your back. You got one arm and you're swimming. You're like
Hmm.
because you've removed a complete option, like a complete array of options, honestly, from the table. And so now you have no choice but to try to find out this piecemeal way of addressing it. And it's not that the piecemeal way isn't ever the way to go, because sometimes
Right.
maybe it is, right? It's the point here isn't about let's debate over, whether it is in some cases and in others. It's you've completely shut the conversation down. There is no
Right.
conversation. It's you've already gotten the foregone conclusion, which is one thing has to be completely eliminated. And unfortunately, because of that, we all just have to sit here and suffer and wait until, I think of the movie Toy Story, the claw, but the claw is the market. The claw decides who will stay and who will go. The market will decide who will live and who will die, right? And we just have to
Hmm.
wait until, the holy market, which is really just a conglomeration of all of us imperfect humans,
Right.
finally gets it right, and I just don't think that that's the way we should decide everything.
Right. It has merit. It's not without its
Right.
place, but we
Absolutely.
should not turn it into the entire story. It's not the only
Don't
game in
reify
town.
it.
We don't reify it. Right. And yeah, I think if you were going to make it a kind of a summary of where we're heading with this, it's to say that there's definitely value in in an economic way of thinking, but
Mm,
it's often done as an exclusive path to truth when, if separated from other branches of human knowledge like virtue and ethics and history and sociology, if you separate it,
mhm.
in politics, if you separate it and just treat it as the source, the path to truth, you're going to miss a lot about the world. And so now we wanted to shift the discussion to something closer to what we consider first principles, not narrowly economic, but definitely in the middle of the political economy kind of conversations that were more frequent, 100 years ago, when Menger and Adam Smith and Ricardo and these earlier generation of thinkers, the early Austrian school, when they were writing. So they were, you'll come across this term spontaneous order in that time, in that literature. And it's really just referring to, it's kind of like juxtaposing two different kinds of order. So you have spontaneous order, and then you have on the other end of it would be like a centrally planned order, or a construct to use a Hayekian term, a constructivist order. Something's constructed and planned, right? And so the Austrians are really up out front in explaining how markets and prices and even things like money and the law itself is this evolved, emerging order that is not something that is, planned from the beginning, right? And yes, there's elements of planning in it, right? Somebody might have a law they want to pass, and that's something they've constructed, right? But there's this give and take. There's this feedback system whereby other people have to agree that, yeah, that law sounds good, we're going to adopt this. And so there is still this evolutionary sort of story playing out, where things are, there's a variation that is proposed, and then it's either adopted and becomes part of the genetic code of that society, or it doesn't, right?
Right.
And so the kind of the quintessential way this is described is like a footpath. When you're first learning about the spontaneous order, there's this idea is you have this person walking along in the woods, and they're just seeking to get to the coastline. Maybe they can hear the waves in the distance, and they don't have a clear path to take. They just start walking, and they obviously avoid the thorny bushes, and they walk around the trees, and they're heading in the direction of where they're trying to go, and they're obviously going to try to take the quickest route, because that's just human nature. So over time, another person might come along, and instead of carving a new path from, fresh through the jungle, they see a slight worn footpath that the person before came through, and maybe it goes around the thorns and the trees, and goes to where they're going, so they follow it.
Mm,
And then, with no intentions of creating anything for anybody in the future, it's just trying to meet their own needs of getting to the coast, right? And over time, other people come along, and the story goes is that the footpath gets worn, and it gets wider and more obvious, and so maybe one day it gets paved, down the road or whatever. But the point is that all these people cooperated and to create this road. Even the initial people had a big hand in it, and saying, directing its path and everything. But none of them had the intention, to say, I'm going to create a road 50 years from now that people are going to use, right? That was never part of it. So that is a way of understanding that there are stable patterns and institutions, or footpaths or roads, or just things that exist in society that we make use of, that serve our needs, that weren't consciously designed for that purpose. And so when you can understand an order that way, it's called an emergent order, or a
mm,
spontaneous order, right? And this is powerful for understanding the evolution of all kinds of things, from language. Like, think of language, right? Nobody sat down and said, hey, I'm going to design a system of sounds that's going to perfectly, reflect what we use today, right?
right.
No, maybe somebody had an idea, but it certainly has changed. And as you look, as time goes on, there's new words and new sayings, and all, and it's a living project, right?
Oh yeah.
And that is true of a lot of things. Yet the Austrians that talk about these sorts of issues often will stop at the boundary of the state. and of politics and of the legal system and of the law itself and of the
Right.
Constitution, if you want to go constitutional. So these things are not talked about in terms of some kind of an evolved emergent order. They're usually discussed as consciously designed. And of course, yes, the Declaration of Independence was authored, and so was the Constitution. So these things do have authors, but they were created in a context of compromise with information with being informed by discussions across all kinds of groups of people, right? So it's not simply the matter of somebody sat down and mapped it all out, right? A lot of it did come about through compromise, and as time goes on, it's amended through compromise and through discussion and through experimentation.
Mhm.
It's not clear that what the outcome of any given change in policy might be. You think but obviously there's an experimental layer to this, and obviously unintended consequences happen. So really the point is that the idea that politics is purely a constructed order and has no spontaneity to it is not has no bottom up in link to individuals, right? Just basic normal people. That's a misguided idea, because clearly we are voting, we are talking to our neighbors, we are donating money to campaigns and discussing political platforms and retweeting things, and all of these activities come up to create a certain view and cultural moment,
Mhm.
where things are either acceptable or they're not, right? And it's not something that you could say is just reduced to a plan. And I feel so, to bring this into like the concrete, it's a bit like there's a division of labor occurring here, right? And we talk about the division of labor in markets. Obviously, if people in factories are all they share different, they don't share the same, they don't all share the same task. They separate tasks, and people get better at certain tasks, specialize in certain things. And as things become more complicated, that specialty increases even more.
Mhm.
And and that story in markets has a political analog where there's also a political complexity that's involved, and there's questions about what policy should look like, and you can't be an expert on all of that stuff, right? And so clearly there's a need for others who can specialize in one sphere or the other, and you give advice or whatever, right? So this notion that we can just walk away from politics, and just everything could be a voluntary contract, and you don't need to have this political division of labor with experts and bureaucrats and studies and none of that. No, no, it's all you can just better than anybody else what your preferences are, assuredly. And so it would be maximizing welfare, this is the claim, if we could let everybody essentially take over the political dimension and collapse politics into commerce, essentially, and have all of those political questions and the ideas and the knowledge that's embedded in all that is just lost, and we're gonna let the individual plan it for themselves and not have to divide or specialize. It's just, no, everything. You can, Ryan, more about what the foreign policy should be than the experts. More than what the health policy should be than the experts. This it's just this fear of expertise and this arrogant idea that I know best, and I don't need to rely on the expertise of anybody else, right? That's all corrupting. That kind of goes with this idea that there's not really a need for dividing that labor. That it's Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, and I was gonna say, and that, you could probably find any single individual who may be better than a given expert because maybe they've just done a lot more research than the expert. But you're talking about, but this isn't just you, that one person, it's everybody taking on that role. And,
Right.
The kind of problems that come out of that, so it's not just simply like, okay, I'm sure you can find a lot of, you know, fairly sharp individuals are really knowledgeable, and maybe they could make a really good decision, but that's not the point. The point is that you're asking
Everybody.
everybody. And I don't think, I mean, when I look at, the average stance on certain things, I don't know if I would want to I would want to necessarily
Yeah.
have to deal with the fallout from that, of the decisions that would be made from some of the, some of these other people. So,
Well, I think about iPencil, right? Nobody knows how to make a pencil. That's the kind of the quintessential example that you learn in Austrian economics about division of labor. You talk about all the different steps that are necessary to make a pencil, whether it's mining the lead or the iron ore, turning it, making the machines and purifying and using the steel and all the things that would require to make a pencil. Regardless, not talking about the boats that transfer the stuff over the seas and everything, right? So it's a huge task, and the Austrians are great about talking about how these
mhm.
questions are complicated and how you need all these different hands involved, right? And it's like, yeah, that's a good story. And there's also a story there that's very similar in the political sphere, right? With the political division of labor.
Right.
And I feel like that's the main that is so it's another example of halfway applying a really good idea.
Right. And I can already hear at least a certain sector of people going, well, and I've seen this one thing, I can't remember if his name was Tom Hunt or what have you, but he had written an article from what he considered a left libertarian direction. He wasn't an anarchist, but he talked about how like we oftentimes ignore the wisdom of the crowd. And he talked about how the wisdom of the crowd can oftentimes beat out the expert. So if you've got 500 people and they have to guess the weight, you take the average of all those people,
You get a better number.
they're gonna get a
Yeah.
better number. But
Yeah.
that's not necessarily defending the kind of atomized, everyone just select on your own perspective necessarily. Because the wisdom of the crowd, that means there was some kind of collaboration going on there at some point. Like, we're going to
Right.
take, not necessarily everyone's talking to each other, but there has to be some kind of coordinating that goes on. It's
Right.
not just, you off over here just deciding some independent decision, right? There's a larger network going on. And I think that's what a lot of this gets to is that now we talk about, well, what institutions are going to work well doing the coordinating, and it may be a multiplicity of types of institutions. Some might be governmental, some might be non-governmental of different kinds. They could be for-profit, they could be non-profit. And I mean non-profit in a more serious sense, right? But it's not going to be just this, Mary over here decided she's going to use this electric company and she's going to use this private protection agency and she thinks this person can do health policy really well, or maybe she wants to do health policy. Like, it's not going to be like that, right? And so what you're talking about with this, the importance of having these institutions that you kind of can cede to in some way. You can say, all right, for these issues, you'll make sure you take care of some of these tasks. It frees us all up, right? Because now we're not basically being the one person trying to build the entire car in the factory, right? Because if
Right.
you or I tried putting aside, I don't even have the skills to attempt it, but let's just say I did. If I tried to build the entire car at Ford factory and I have the skills, it's going to take forever. And we're not going to have a good output at Ford factory. It's not going to be great. And so in such much the same way, and you've hinted at this before, and we've talked about it privately, just that essentially you can apply that same thing with these institutions. When each individual doesn't have to make so many decisions like that as an individual, right? It frees us all up to do all kinds of other things, and we're all
Right.
richer and safer and better off for it. That doesn't
Exactly.
mean blindly doing it, right? It doesn't mean, okay, I guess John Bolton controls foreign policy and we'll just all sit back and let him, nuke Iran,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
that,
Right. Right.
like that's not what's being defended here.
No.
But there are oftentimes, as we get back to what was said earlier about the whole Robinson Crusoe thing, like that's the way they're thinking. It's like you're this self-sufficient. I don't like ostracism and all this other stuff, right? I don't want to feel like there's ever any pressure on me at all. And it's like, well, then you don't want to be in a society because it is inevitable that there's going to be some kind of a pressure. Even if you had your competing private agency situation, they're going to be putting their pressures on you too.
Oh,
And
yeah.
David Friedman pointed out, okay, so let's just say you got rid of the kind of political mechanisms you're talking about here, and the market controlled it all. It's going to take shape, whatever that area you're in, however big it is, right? That what the culture is demanding there. And he says you don't get necessarily a libertarian law code or
No.
anything close to it. You're going to get whatever is dominant there. The market provides, right?
Yeah.
And so, but do you necessarily want that? Would we say that if there was it just so happened there was in a given area where enough, people who defended, abuse of children all got together and they had enough power and they're like, well, it looks like the law code says this can happen, that we go, well, that's it. I guess we have to accept it. That's what the market determined.
Right.
That would seem absurd,
Yeah.
and it would fly in the face of pretty much almost any ethical decision-making framework I've ever heard of.
Well,
Um,
but that's what happens when you take a single variable and you maximize it, right? Like
right,
freedom to contract, right? Or
right,
individual liberty, right? If you make that your lodestar, then you end up having to apologize for everything that can kind of come under that. And
right,
and like and to your point, it's not a given that freedom and spontaneity and emergence is always everywhere going to yield socially optimal results. It
right,
can yield a Haiti. And then what do
right.
you do?
What do you
What,
do?
you say,
Why
okay,
isn't
we have
it
to accept
spontaneously
it.
going in a better direction?
Or no, well, if you're a committed ideologue and you're not flexible, you'll say, well, it's not ideal, but we have to accept it because
Mm,
this is the
yeah,
logic that this is the logic I've dedicated myself to. It's whatever emerges or whatever's spontaneous or whatever's free, right?
right,
And it's like, well, wait a minute, you could have a better outcome and just give up some of the ideological baggage, right? And like,
yeah,
why is it so important, right? To be this purist. And I
right,
feel like that's kind of the problem is this this requirement for
right.
purity at the expense of something that could be marginally better.
And yet, how you've pointed out before, how when it becomes this kind of all or nothing thing of like, hey, I want the state to go away, but hey, I kind of agree that's probably not going to happen. It leaves us into the status quo, like nothing changes, and we just now you get the state in a really bad outcome. So congrats,
Right.
like it.
Right.
So
Liberty plus.
yeah, what's on the other side of that plus, right? Yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah. So
Well, I mean, I got a thought so we could wrap up with.
okay, yeah.
So there's this principle in Austrian economics called demonstrated preference.
Hmm.
And Rothbard talks about this quite a bit. And it's this idea that you really can't know what people's preferences are, but you do get a window into it when they show them to you by demonstrating them, right? So
Mhm.
if you were to they say, for example, if I were to spend my days working out, exercising, you could say, well, he's demonstrated preference for a fit, healthy body, right?
Mhm.
And you could say it's that ranking is higher than say the disutility for working out.
Right.
So these kind of preference rankings just reveal themselves in action, right? That's what demonstrated preference really means.
Mhm.
We and Austrians tend to stop at the boundaries of economics with with this concept, right? In financial exchanges and things. Okay,
Yeah.
preference for a Snickers or a preference for a cheeseburger or whatever. But when we go out and do anything at all, we're showing our preferences, right? Whether we're engaging in charity, we're showing we value having a world where people are taken care of. And when
Right.
we engage in community building events or when we engage in political activities, which many people do, all over the country, it's very common to see people engaging in politics, whether it's voting or writing their congressman or donating to a campaign or just talking about it, right? What policies should be.
Mhm.
So to kind of wrap this all up, this call to erase politics and collapse it all into market exchange ignores the preferences of the actors in the system because they
Right.
have demonstrated preference for these institutions. That's how we got them. They weren't
Mhm.
some alien force thrown on us from some external threat, some external process. It's like we were embedded in them. We co-create them and we continue to co-create them as we go. So this anarchist call for anarcho-capitalist institutions is would be imposing on people that which they do not want, which is the kind of value judgments, imposing value judgment. That's the very thing that Austrians spend so much time saying that is so bad about government intervention, is that it's imposing things on people that they don't want, and then it's counterproductive and inefficient.
Yeah.
So
It's
it's like, well,
essentially
yes,
go ahead.
expand that. Go ahead.
It's essentially having asking the person, will you push the button, but you already pushed their hand down on the button for them, you know?
Right.
Being the button being, the state goes away overnight, right?
Right.
You know,
Yes, yes,
so
yes.
it's like, oh, will you push the button? Oh, don't worry, I've already got your hand pushed down for you on it.
The invisible hand.
The invisible.
There's your invisible hand right there. Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
that's right.
Yeah. So I think that does a good job. I mean, the purposes of these, because now we have three videos that we're going to kind of mesh together,
Yeah.
is to just get this sense of, all right, Austrian economics has something to serve us with, right? It has something to show us. We can learn some valuable lessons from Austrian economics, but due to its strong relationship with libertarian philosophy and the pitfalls that we've looked at that comes from this rigid version of it anyway, it runs into all kinds of problems. And
Yeah.
the mixed economy framework is imperfect because people are imperfect, but at its best, it's seeking to look at this problem, looking at the issues that can come from markets, especially when they're singularly focused on, or looking at government when it's just singularly focused on, or it's taken for granted that any action it does is going to be good, or that it can do certain things, maybe it can't.
Right.
And it's saying, look, let's look at the overall conditions, start from where we're at, take the strengths from both where we can, and always push to do better. And I mean, what more can you ask from us, quite honestly? Because the alternative, if we're going to go back to that, you've got to collapse the dichotomy into a monism, essentially. And the monism is either going to be total government control, and we've seen how that can go. Granted, it almost never fully gets there because even the Soviets had to use black markets and all kinds of stuff, right?
Exactly.
But when you try to go as far as you
Go
can
that
towards it,
way.
it doesn't necessarily end very well. But when it comes to this other alternative that the anarcho-capitalists are pushing it towards of just markets, 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 well, if you've been paying attention listening to this video of us, then you would see it's not so clear that that's going to work out the way you think it is. And we would rather all of us work together to make what we have currently much better. And that's what we hope when we make this paper, that we can make maybe even a bit more clear. And we'll have a lot more other, case examples and cover more ground, worker co-ops and,
Yes.
different societies. And I think it will be a pretty good paper. And I'm very happy to have Ryan here to write it with me. He's just got a lot of the
I'm thrilled.
econ down even more than I have. So I think it will be good.
Well, I think we complement each other, and yeah, I'm excited too. So
Well,
enjoyed the conversation.
me too. Thank you so much, Ryan.
All right. Thank you.
Till next time.